Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the TNT pre-show for season 3, episode 6. This is your opportunity to check your audio and check your video. Pour yourself a glass of scotch, maybe some apple juice, topped off by some vanilla ice cream. Never know what dessert I'm going to recommend each week. The pandemic health orders in BC have been eased as of Bonnie Henry's announcement today. So hopefully gatherings and celebrations of art will be on the rise in the not so distant future. So now's my favorite rhyme. Full screen, please. Justine, thank you. As per usual, we'll do a little call out for people to consider taking a membership here at the Audain Art Museum. Individual memberships are $75 and dual memberships are $100. This week, our product from the shop is art making. Ooh, what do we have here? A watercolor set and watercolor paper. So to make all your beautiful aesthetic delights. And in addition to that, wow, we have a bear puzzle, a rainbow bear puzzle by Richard Shorty, this wonderful rainbow bear. All available at shopaudain.com, online or in person. And now I'll go to a little tiny screen. So the museum remains open Thursday to Sunday, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. And this week we're open on Monday, which is BC Family Day. And that marks the final day of the Jean-Paul Riopel exhibition, The Call of Northern Landscapes and Indigenous Cultures. So I would encourage everyone to get up to Whistler this weekend, take a bus from downtown, maybe ride a bike, it's nice out now, or just drive a car with snow tires to take in this, what has proven to be one of the most important exhibitions in this museum's brief history. In addition to that, we have a wonderful new layout for the permanent collection. So I see by the clock, we're just 1 minute away from going live. Another Bluebird week here in Whistler, where skiing is second to cultural consumption, and we'll keep that going here. So, another 40 seconds before we go live. I'd also want to say that beginning on April 2nd, a brand new exhibition, Wolves, the Art of Dempsey Bob, that opens to the public at 1 p.m. on Saturday, April 2nd. And this will be a major undertaking for this museum in conjunction with the Michael Canadian Collection. We'll also have on hand a 200-page hardcover book of stories by Dempsey Bob, accompanied by works. A real wonderful offering coming this spring to the Audain Art Museum. I see by the clock it's 8 o'clock and 9 seconds. Full screen, Justine. Welcome to Tuesday Night Talks, Season 3, Episode 6. Health orders here in BC and across Canada are being eased. So I would encourage everyone to still stay safe and be nice. Tonight, we're back in the museum's vault as my earbud falls out for the 4th time. And where are we? We're by the flashlights glow. Here at the Audain Art Museum in Whistler, British Columbia, on the shared territories of the Squamish and Lil'wat nations. Tonight, as per usual, we have over 250 people registered for the talk. And we're going to talk about this piece that's eerily behind me here in the vault, called Termini of 2008. And now we go live to Powell Street near Oppenheimer Park to Stephen Waddell. Good evening, Stephen.
Good evening, Curtis. Hi, thank you for the invitation. Nice to be here with you.
And I understand your studio is in an old 1890 brick building there. That's perhaps one of the oldest buildings in that neighborhood.
That's correct. It is from the 1890s. The water was switched on in 1890. I think that's the record that you can use. So it is the oldest building.
Okay. Well, I think a good place to start would be, before we get to Termini, a few weeks of works that led up to that. And we'll jump right into the discussion with a piece called A Resting Worker of 2000. Perhaps you can talk about the composition of this image and how you approach your work for pieces such as this.
Yeah, sure. This is an early picture that I made with what I would call an amateur camera. I was in 1997, 98, just looking for economy in what I was doing. And so the composition of this picture is based on going to a drive-in theater in Stuttgart and seeing a worker resting, which I thought had a valuable reason to be recorded faithfully.
And how many shots would have you taken of this worker resting before you make a final selection?
A number. I would say I don't usually shoot a lot, but maybe 10, maybe 3 of those 10 have the composition that I want. So not many to choose from. And
originally, how would you have produced this work in terms of materials?
Well, that's an interesting question. So at the beginning, these photographs were actually intended as studies for paintings. So I actually made paintings of this photograph to begin with. And then I decided that they were really meant to be life-scale photographs. So the original presentation that I did in 2001 was a print, a series of pictures together, all of the same figure, all doing the same thing, shot within a few minutes. And that trio, or that suite of pictures, was the original manifestation for this resting worker.
And you reference painting, and in looking into your background, I mean, that was could we say, a jumping off point for you? And can you maybe discuss the relationship of painting to your photography?
Yes, painting is what I started making. And through the middle 90s, I was very interested in color and what it had to do with representation. I was interested in figuration, in realism. And so what led me in the late 90s to decide that my photographs should just be photographs is that they had to be life scale, and I wanted areas of color in the photographs to resemble or dissemble in terms of the solidity of them, like the way a painting would. So maybe subject matters had some relation to do with painting, but subject matters often had to do with the history of photography quickly. But maybe the way to compose and the way to use color had a lot to do with painting.
And I mean, when you first come upon a scene such as this worker resting, does it occur to you that the red of the cab of the truck is bouncing quite nicely off his pants?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very magpie effect in my early photography. I think the color is emotive. It's undoubtedly emotive. I'm not sure that everybody seeks the same narrative in relationship to it, but color does imbue a notion of narrative. It suggests some ambiguity or some relationship to pigment outside of the world that we know or inside the world we know. So these relationships, although they could appear as almost kitsch, should we say, are also for me a place to start making pictures.
Okay, let's move to the next piece called Chimney Sweep of 2003. And again, I'm just wondering how you just happened upon a fellow engaged in this task.
Yeah, so this young woman whose name was Anna was a chimney sweep, and I had coal heating in my studio in Berlin when I first moved there, which was quite an onerous experience. But what did come out of that experience was meeting the chimney sweeps, and I felt that I could make a picture about labor, about them, about their costume, but also that they were constantly involved with soot and things to do with carbon burning. And at the same time, they were walking around on the roofs up in the air in the sunshine, or could be in the rain or the fog. So I knew that I wanted to make pictures, most of them on the ground, and that I did. And then also up on the rooftops above everything.
Now, at this time, it's 2003. Are you still shooting analog?
I only shoot analog until an hour ago. So there's no the digital creep is very slow in my oeuvre. I've never really found the digital medium to be very rewarding, and film is a very robust medium in that large format or medium format film still carries a larger capture of both atmospheric color than digital does. And I also make my pictures large-ish in the sense that they're printed life scale. So I need an imbuement of color and an encapsulation of the atmosphere that film renders very well, and digital kind of doesn't at the moment. Okay.
Now, I'm also curious, you definitely in this early work have a focus on workers, a very everyday, I guess, experiences, and how that relates to painting. Édouard Manet comes up in terms of thinking about a relationship of this type of photography to painting. And can you expand on your interest in the worker?
Yeah, in the late 90s, I was interested in figuration, as painting had represented it through the 19th century, and how figuration had moved into modern photography in a powerful way. I wanted to deal with the human figure. I wanted to know how it would be to represent and to observe people in urban space, not in a theatrical way, not so that they would know that I was necessarily there, but that their lives were conducted of their own choice in terms of movement and transit. Through occupation was very interesting to me. So labor is, of course, the one visible part of the city where you see people sometimes in uniforms, sometimes in garb, which you could recognize as one profession or other. It has something to do with thinking about August Sander and his 19th century portraits and his categorization of people from scientists, workers, artists. So part of my inclination was photographic, part of it was painterly, but mostly to deal with the history of 19th century photography, which I was fascinated with at that point.
And if we go to the next piece, please, called the disentangler. A disentangler, a chimney sweep. These aren't common professions in North America. Is there a certain European flair to what you do?
Well, the chimney sweep is a very specific German and French. I mean, also the English have a long sort of myth around the chimney sweep. Chimney sweeps are meant, or if you see a chimney sweep in Germany, it's thought that it's lucky because you don't see them that often. But I did like the garb, the costume. I thought its anachronisms were sort of like the return of the repressed or something that you would see willingly. I mean, the disentangler is simply this gentleman in Japan sitting on a bench, finding a moment to pull apart threads of something or other, he's either making or pulling apart, and I couldn't quite tell which, but it felt like he was making an interior out of an exterior.
And there seems to be a random compositional elements that kind of bring this image together. The way that the wall behind him butts out just around him and the bench. Can you talk about the composition of this image?
Sure. Japanese architecture and divisions between public and private are not unrecognizable to a North American, but they have a distinct difference in how things are formed. And so a public park could appear as much as a small square of literally gravel, a kind of micro park, so to speak, which is what this is. And then suddenly you have a concrete wall and there might be residential on the other side. So walking around Tokyo or Yokohama in parts of Japan, you start to understand the fabric of how cities are put together over hundreds and hundreds of years. So the composition of this was very frontal. Obviously, we need to see what he's doing somehow, but I wanted it to be in the middle of a gesture. So photography is not narrative, so it's either suggesting a pulling or a raveling or something. And then the detritus around also reminds us that there's not necessarily one person who uses this space.
And would this fellow have noticed that you were taking this photograph? And if so, did he respond? Or what is that relationship between yourself and the subject been like over the course of your career?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I said earlier, I try to avoid the theatrical encounter where people know that I'm around, because I want to try and represent them as though I'm not there, as though if I could be invisible, but I can't because I'm framing and I'm using film, and finally these images become manifestations. But I think once somebody recognizes that you were there or that you want to take a picture of them, they will immediately probably do something else and not the thing for which caught your eye. I do often ask people to make photographs of them. I mean, for instance, Anna, the chimney sweep, that had to be prearranged. I couldn't just, find myself on the rooftop of buildings in Berlin, Schöneberg, and hope to find a chimney sweep that day. So that had to be prearranged. And so many photographs that I make, I hope they look for a minute like they're not arranged, but some of them have to be.
Oh, that's an interesting difference within, I guess, a comparable set of images. Let's move now to another really fascinating image, the Asphalt Layer 2 of 2005. And where is this taking place, and what drew you to this individual?
Well, I was very drawn. I mean, this is very close to my studio in Berlin when I was living there. And I would, as a routine, I would just leave my studio and just photograph whatever was happening around my studio within a square kilometer. That seemed like a fairly good, morning strategy. Maybe after lunch, I might do something different. However, I was interested in trying to represent labor also as a pseudo-artistic activity, such that this man's wooden tool for which he's forming the asphalt now represents almost like a Jackson Pollock attempt to make a scatter painting. And so I like the duality where you could have one profession metaphorically signaling another one, yet it's literally about smearing asphalt into a cavity on top of dirt so that the seamlessness of the street might reappear.
And obviously, Berlin plays into a large part of this early work. Can you talk about your transition from Vancouver to Berlin and why that happened and how it affected you?
Sure. I left Vancouver as a painter, and probably I came back as a misguided photographer. But Berlin was certainly not the place to be making photographs, but I ended up there, attracted to the city. It's a very muscly city. When I lived there from 97 forward, it was in formation between parts of the city that had been either repurposed, redeveloped, or in future development contemplation. So as a place to live and work, it had a lot of fascination of a city that I'd never sort of encountered before. But I was still making paintings for a period of time, from say 97 to 2000. And then there was a certain point where I felt like I wanted to make quite a strong group of pictures that had a lot to do with Berlin and had a lot to do with my time there. And definitely the labor and the asphalt layers and chimney sweeps, and the list goes on, were that attempt early on. So I feel like I caught some essence, a bit of mimesis using Eugene Atget and August Sander. and thinking about how the city may have been represented through 19th century painting. So Berlin was quite important, but I felt like I was not really making photographs for anybody there to see. They were just for my own distinct study.
And this would have been originally produced as either a C print or a chromogenic print, is that correct?
This originally would have been made as a chromogenic print, yes, in 2005, because we still had not arrived in the era of robust inkjet pigment archival yet.
And then similar, what would roughly the dimension of a piece like this be roughly?
This is roughly, well, in meters, it's like 145 by 160.
Okay, and again, using that scale, what experience are you trying to anticipate with the viewer?
I think that there is a certain size of picture when you make it, depending on how far away the camera was from the subject. So let's say I was approximately, I don't know, like 3-4 meters away from the asphalt layer. So what I'm hoping to in the presentation is not necessarily have exactly life scale, but approaching life scale, such that you could feel for the moment that you are the correct distance from that subject for which the encounter was built on.
Very good. Okay, so let's move to another location in Europe and a piece called the Snail Cellar of 2008, and maybe talk about the location and what drew you to this image.
So this is actually shot in Beirut in Lebanon in the wintertime.
Oh, my mistake. Clearly not Europe.
But it has the kind of, the Arab housing in the back. So what drew me to this was how, say, a marketplace could just appear informally on a highway where people are blazing by, but they would stop to get their snails. And I spent probably 3-4 hours with this snail seller, this man, in the pouring rain in December, just watching him try to keep the water out of the scale. So if somebody did drive up, he could get the snails in there and get the proper weight. We didn't talk much, but I thought it was a fairly beautiful set between his aging truck and tarp formation, and then the 4 vats of snails that he had raised himself, just inching up the back of the tailgate.
Inching and snails, they go together quite well. Okay, I think now is the time that we can really dig into the work in the museum's collection that came courtesy of Michael Audain and Yoshi Karasawa. It's off display at the moment here in the vault, and we're going to talk about some of the circumstances around that. But we'll bring up this piece from 2008 called Termini, and perhaps you can let us in on the location, what drew you to the location, and the 2 individuals in the foreground.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time going from Berlin to Rome, thinking that I could make pictures there, and I've made some that I think are successful. This is one, which means that you arrive in the main train station in Rome called Termini. This happened to be a wintertime, and I arrived, I think 3 or 4 days in a row at Termini in the morning, quite early, and I found these 2 people who were occupying what is kind of little island boulevard across from the bus stop. And it appeared to me after a few days of watching them that they were watching, not just watching, but washing the street, occupying this space. And if people got too close, they would throw whatever bucket of water they had at them. It was kind of an amazing, almost like a theater play between people who imagine an interior and an exterior space. And there's no way to romanticize and glamorize what could appear to be homelessness or not having a fixed address. But these 2 people seem to be projecting a kind of ownership and a kind of occupation, which was so much different than I'd ever encountered in my time in various cities making photographs. And just the manner with which they carried about the objects and various things that they would maneuver around. And just watching how other people would navigate and move around them, and that whole ballet between those who are working and those who are occupying a space and looking around.
And it's interesting because when you really look closely at this picture, the woman furthest from the foreground appears to be looking at the camera. So did you have any direct experience with these two ladies, or did they notice you?
Yeah,
And
they
if so,
noticed
what?
me. They noticed me. But the rules were the same for me as they were for everybody else. Don't come too close. They didn't seem to even think about the camera very much. It was just whether I was getting too close to them. And so, yes, the woman farthest away from us did notice me, but she didn't do anything more than just look at that point. And so I went on. I think I shot probably about 10 or 11 shots. This seemed to be the one that said something about the arrangement of their lives and the idea of the street reflecting the light from above at sunrise in the wintertime. Seemed to me that a lot of things came together at that moment.
And when you're presenting these images, do you have any expectation that the viewer will use, some of the visual cues here, whether it's the nature of signage or maybe something written on the side of a bus, or something that will tell you whether it's North America, Europe, the Middle East, or other locations in Asia that you've produced images from?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. That's kind of complex, but I do think that a lot of the pictures I've made could have been made in other cities. I have a feeling that I've been to a number of cities, a number of places, and made photographs, but I somehow feel that if no matter what culture I'd be dropped into, I would find something that I personally could relate to and make an image of. So signage, yeah, that's one way to find out. I do like images. I like making images that don't have too many signs of the location. I like that it could be mistaken for, or it could be partly this or partly that, because it is the figuration that I'm interested in, the actual presence of human beings and their drama.
And when you're kind of circulating in these urban centers around the world, do you tend to gravitate towards places that people collect?
There's two ways to think about it. One could be to imagine a picture you want to see, and to go towards places and accumulations of people that resemble that picture you have in mind. And then the other strategy, which is just an age-old strategy, which is hit or miss, is to just go where people accumulate and where where the conglomeration of people exists. It could be transiting from subways or moving in and around architecture in tight spaces or wide open spaces. So there's several ways to do it, but just by chance works, and then what should we call it? A more contrived chance. There's other options of doing things.
And recently, we had this work reprinted, and that's an important process that many museums and private collections are going through, particularly with those photo-based works that date back, anywhere from 20 to 50 or 100 years. And can you discuss the new methods of producing images and how you're taking responsibility for that in your work that's distributed through a variety of collections?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question today. I think that we're in an era where color printing in photographic form has some really great abilities using inkjet, using archival inks that are light fast, and also have a wider gamut. One of the big disinclinations to stop using chromogenic technology, C41, using the actual papers, was that the color gamut was beautiful, but it was limited. And one of the major discoveries for most people who make color photographs of any scale is that inkjet is far superior, both to look at and to deal with. And of course, the archival element, chromogenic prints, anybody who's made them and has disseminated them and have them acquired by others is dealing with all of these ramifications of reprinting. But it's nice to have the feeling that when you reprint, you've actually done the work of not just succeeding to replace it, but to make it better. And in almost every case that I've had to reprint, I've been very happy to make something that was even better than I even thought I could make early on.
And we're so thrilled that, you know, we just recently engaged in the process of having this piece behind me reprinted. And as I said, we'll be introducing it back into the permanent collection, I would say in the next 6 months. So
Fantastic.
now we're going to the Q&A part of TNT. And we've got some really interesting questions tonight. First, we have a question from John in Victoria, and he asks, what's the difference between photojournalism and conceptual photography?
Well, conceptual photography, I don't really know what that means, but I guess I get it. It's people have assigned this phrase to photography that people may have begun to think about the object of photography, the idea of what photography we use for representationally, then moving on through the idea of what the influence of cinema is on photography. There's many layers, but I don't know if conceptual photography really exists as a thing. I think we like to think it does. But because everything could be a conceptual photograph, if you look back through the history of photography. Everybody thought about what they were going to do and everybody had an intention. So voila, that's pretty much everything's conceptual. Photojournalism in itself, we attribute that kind of adventure, that fearless adventure of photographing things on the move as photojournalism, perhaps, or photographing things that need to be recorded now and disseminated, distributed. We've witnessed that through the history of photography being used as a news source. So photojournalism is maybe sometimes separated off, and that it could be used as an applied sense of photography, a commercial sense of photography. Our Vancouver sense of what conceptual photography is could be described as people who slow things down, make things that might have to do with a studio practice, might have to do with a mise en scène or other, and otherwise are using photography rather than just applying it.
Oh, that's a very interesting way to differentiate those two types of practice.
I could be wrong.
How and why did photography become such an important part of the contemporary scene in Vancouver?
I think it became very important everywhere. I think we have this idea that it somehow that Vancouver had a light shine down from the heavens, and somehow only people here were suddenly using photography in such a way. It probably became very important because there was a number of people working here thinking through models of cinema, models of larger format picture making. That could be Ian Wallace, that could be Jeff Wall and others. And perhaps just the fact that there was quite a few people at once using photography meant the accumulation could have been witnessed at a time maybe in other cities is not, but there's many other cities for which photography is also quite present. Okay, so next question comes from Kayla in Montreal, and she asks, what qualities does black and white photography bring to the image that is absent in color photography? Well, I guess I can answer that personally. For me, black and white photography carries with it drawing, carries with it grisaille, carries with it a different sense of mood that could probably not be created with color photography. At least that's the way I use it, the way I want to conjure certain moods. So it has been used historically for all sorts of atmospheric effects through the whole history of it. So in that sense, maybe color photography has other atmospheres and other moods. I don't know. It's kind of hard to direct compare and say one doesn't have it, but it's definitely a different language.
And then the final question that we'll have is Pam from Hope asks, what's the importance of location with regards to the international quality of your images?
Mhm. Well, location often has to do with places for which certain events or stories, experiences have occurred. Those could be cinematic references, those could be painting references, those could be the history of photography references. And I simply sometimes go to where those narratives started. So it could be like going to find a lost monument on the edge of Berlin. It's not going to be in the edge of Greater Vancouver. So I have to go to where those locations are. There could be a location here that could contain something and fascinating here too. So it doesn't have to be international. It just might have to do with a whole line of ideas that I'm thinking about, and they might be across the water. They may be here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Those are some wonderful questions that come in from our viewers in advance. Next, we'll move to your current production. And the first piece that we'll look at is called Academy of 2021.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the location and what you're
Sure.
trying to achieve?
Yeah. This and a few pictures coming up, Curtis, are from an exhibition I had at Monte Clark last October. And that exhibition was a chance for me to think about sculpture, about objects, about sort of dispossessed objects, found objects, the relationship of art and its discard. In this case, we had me and Édouard. The two figures are not facing us. They're not regarding the objects, which are paintings that could be either thrown away or reused. And at the rate cycle for which art students produce things that are probably not considered to be part of their longevity. So this picture is about this hall, which contains literally waste, but could be recycled, who knows?
Wonderful. And then the next piece is called Chain Carousel, also of 2021. And this has a really interesting positioning of architecture in the foreground and background. Perhaps you can begin with that discussion.
Yeah, it is, again, close to my studio, one of those, 20-minute walks. And here we go. This is the East German Parliament being disassembled in the background very slowly over a process of 3 or 4 years. And that disassembly became a very slow unwinding spectacle in Berlin that, if you were East German, it was an oddity, and it was perhaps even carried a sadness to it. And then for people who were visiting Berlin or living in Berlin that were not a part of that storyline, it was, circus and other things going on and carousels. So there was this constant combination and smashing together of all sorts of ideological release, ideas being torn down, ideas being built up, and then the spectacular image of just play in the face of large decisions.
And one thing that we were talking about earlier today was the fact that you'll often shoot different scenes for 3 or 4 years. Can you speak to that part of your process?
Yeah, it is very difficult to just say, I'm going to head off and make a picture of X person or place. And I'm quite slow the way I work. So I will go back several times and try to see if I can see it better or see it another way or be more accurate about what it is that I want to represent. So going back means that you're rethinking and you are, again, trying to reinvigorate the chance encounter, which is near to impossible, but maybe you get something even better because the chance has been now honed and is being carved out of an experience you had before.
Okay, and then we'll shift quite a bit in terms of the nature of your work to this piece from 2021 called Hollow Figure. This exhibition had to do with sculpture. It had to do with objects.
I find a number of objects around my studio. They are disposed of, they're discarded, and I drag them into my studio and I either wash them or reinvigorate them in terms of their standing, and I photograph them, and I use certain light that may resemble a kind of theatrical presence. And through that reinstigation of lighting and looking at these objects in a different way, it's perhaps some other story is released, and some other aura, maybe a new aura, just a kind of aesthetic, artistic aura of a disposable object becomes visible.
And can you talk about this object and how you've manipulated it through the photography process and before?
Yes. These objects are part of a group of objects that I've both 3D scanned and in some cases returned to a two-dimensional image. So one can actually, as an artist, use different forms of imaging. It's all, they call it cameraless photography, I guess, is the buzz phrase. But in the sense, if you scan it using a number of cameras from many directions, you can put that together in a computer and come up with one single image again.
And so is this an actual cutout that you've scanned the object from, which I'm assuming is just a discarded doll?
It's a discarded mannequin, and yes, it's scanned. It's correct.
Okay. And how does your process in terms of, from random or semi-posed street scenes to very much an intense studio process, how's that different for you?
It's very different, but I still resolve to be interested in figuration and how that inhabitation in the studio could take place through composition, through lighting. The theatrical introduction of light is quite a difference. Obviously, when you're using available light and you're shooting outdoors, it's a much different mise en scène, and you're depending on natural light to provide most of the atmosphere and ambiance. So in the studio, one is then trying to create some other form of atmosphere that you would never encounter in the street. So in some ways you could say it's in complete opposition to the other work that I make, but it has something to do because the objects themselves come from a found area or some other area outside my studio that I might have photographed other pictures.
Okay, and then the next image, we move to a black and white image, and it's the monument. It's a monument, and can you describe what we're looking at, where it is, and how black and white changes the way you produce images?
Mm-hmm. This monument exists on the edge of Brandenburg, very, very West Berlin, and it was erected and designed by a French soldier, I've understood, who at the cessation of the First World War, found himself in this area and decided that the grief and the tragedy that was the First World War needed to be commemorated with a monument about mourning. And so this monument was erected, but it was almost immediately lost. It has not been a part of the social fabric almost forever. And so it exists in a kind of little disarticulated area between public and private land. And during Soviet occupation, it would have been used this whole area would have been used for machines and army bits and bobs. And then there's farming in the area. So then farmers would have taken it over, but the monument wouldn't have been for them a very important thing to look at or contemplate. So it is a lost monument. So its ideological positions, its relationship to mourning are all done more or less in silence without observation.
And the actual figure, is it a kneeling figure? It's
a kneeling figure sitting on a large concrete plinth, and it's positioned in such a way that there's 2 times a day where the light sort of hits the front of the figure, and you can kind of see the details of it. Part of it is kind of chipped away, but it's a monument that is really of its time. It has a certain Art Deco feel to it, and it's inscribed with all sorts of messages and things and poems.
Huh. And the last couple of images that we're going to talk about tonight also come from 2021. And the first one is called Parish Table 1. You're back in the studio, and can you describe what you're trying to achieve with this image?
Yes, this is a this is a tabletop, and I watched it in an alley disintegrate and move away from its original form. It's almost so completely unformed at this moment. But the illusionistic space of a faux wooden surface has now become pigments that are rolled up on the back of an adhesive, and the actual materials of the table are now revealed to be almost nothing. Particle board, ready to disintegrate at any moment. And I thought in terms of ephemera and the idea of something that's so fragile that could just go away from us, something that we already didn't really even care about in its natural and industrial life, is now even more fragile and even more removed from existence and understanding. So I thought that kind of double negative would be interesting to turn into a still life.
And if we move to the second iteration of table, this is 2. And again, in terms of displaying these 2 works, do you want people to see that degradation that occurs?
Yeah, it could be seen as a diptych. I think both pictures describe the fragility of the illusionistic space of the top of a table. The light shining on them is harsh, and the colors no longer resemble anything that we would consider to be normative in terms of a table surface. So when it actually falls off what is the remainder of that table surface, then we know that it really is just shards, and that shard existence is maybe even more melancholic and difficult to deal with, but is resemblant of so much of the exchange of ideas and erratic tendencies that we give to objects.
I can't help but observe when I look at this piece, it just feels like almost like a cubist painting. Is there any relationship to this work to painting for you?
There is. I mean, the notion of that multi-dimensional looking that maybe Cubism was trying to get through its painting, the various people who were the practitioners of it, that does interest me. And also what interests me is the way certain artifacts that we wish were in better shape but aren't, we can still contemplate some of the forms of them. Maybe looking in a museum at objects from 300 or 400 years ago, that we have a reverence for them, but they don't exactly resemble what they resembled when they were made anew.
And would you say, Stephen, that this studio series of objects is complete for you, or is this something that you'll continue to pursue?
No, there's more pictures in this group. The pictures I showed in October was a kind of what we call limited release. So there's maybe more pictures to make. I mean, there's always things being discarded every day that somehow end up in my purview. So who knows? Studio practices, they can linger and go on for a long time.
And will you simultaneously also do your street scenes while you continue this studio work as well?
Yeah, the good habits and the bad habits always keep going. So yes.
Okay. Well, on good habits and bad habits, that's a good place to begin the closing comments. Thank you, Stephen. You've added a great deal of clarity to what you do and the circumstances around your photography. And as I said, we're just so happy to have Termini reprinted and ready for presentation in the next little while. I also want to thank Michael Audain and Yoshi Karasawa. I want to thank our TNT Season 3 patron, Susan Roop. I always like to thank our founders and trustees who really are so generous with the museum. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank all the staff and volunteers that work so hard at keeping this museum open, even in the most challenging of times. A big thank you to the TNT crew here, particularly tonight. It's been a full moon here. Our director producer, Justine Nickel, and our quality control coordinator, Paige Keith. I also want to thank museum members and you, the viewer. As always, I have a shout out to my mom and dad, and this season 3 is in memory of them, as well as my little sister, who's almost at midnight in Canada. Thank you, Susie. And any shout outs from your side, Stephen?
Good question. I'll shout out to my mother, Rosalie, who's hopefully sitting in kits, maybe already, teased her way through this presentation. We'll see.
Okay. Hi, Stephen's mom. So next week, we'll be back in Vancouver, and we'll be in the permanent collection to look at a recent acquisition by Reza Carr. So from the Audain Art Museum in Whistler, BC, on the shared territories of the Squamish and Lillooet Nations. Good night to you, Stephen, and thank you so much.
Good night, Curtis. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.